you have to take a stance. Are our Python Jews? And I'm like, you don't. You really don't.
Hello everyone, Ken here, back with another exciting guest for you. In today's video, I talk with Nick Wan. Nick is one of the few data science Twitch streamers out there. He also has worked in data science for the Cincinnati Reds and currently manages a data science team at KFC. Nick has a very interesting story about moving from his PhD work into the world of data science and sports analytics. He was also on the front page of the New York Times once. Definitely tune in and listen to the interview to figure out how he managed that and how it helped his job prospects. Now on to the interview.
Nick, thank you so much for coming on. You have such unique experience in the data science realm, especially with sports analytics, data science, and baseball. I really wanted to have you come on, kind of talk about some of your background there, also talk about some of the content you're creating on Twitch. So welcome, and I really appreciate you coming in.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
Great stuff. Well, why don't we get started? I'd love to hear about your background, how you got started in the data science field. Maybe that first moment where you realized, wow, this could be a career, wow, I could kind of make something out of this.
Yeah, that first moment was in grad school. So I went to grad school for neuroscience. And so I was at Utah State. Shout out to Carrie Jordan and Ron Gillum. My advisors at the time. I was working on a lot of different neuroscience problems. I was using EEG and this other system called FNIRS. And basically it's recording data at anywhere between 10 to hundreds of samples per second. And then I would take that data, pre-process that data in MATLAB, and then I would do some different transformation on it. And then we would use that resulting information to sort of say this is what we're seeing in the brain when people are doing like our different experiments we had them doing in our lab. So when I was doing that stuff, learning how to do it, doing experiments, I also wanted to make sure I was able to explain it in a good way, in a way that people who didn't know neuroscience or people who were not familiar with my field would be able to understand. And so I started a blog, which is no longer around anymore, but in my blog, I would take just the statistical things I learned or the mathematical or programmatic things that I've learned and try to apply it to other data. And that data ended up being sports data. So a lot of my analyses and a lot of my knowledge of statistics always has some sort of like analog to like sports or something. So like if we're talking about like a t-test, we don't have to talk about a t-test in terms of like the brain and different brain activities between groups, but we could talk about a t-test in terms of like how good does a free throw shooting team do on the road versus away. So that kind of stuff started leading me down a path towards like explaining just different things that were happening currently in different sports. And at the moment, at that particular moment in my life, around 2015, there was a student section at Arizona State University that was really getting a lot of coverage. It's called, they named their student section the Curtain of Distraction. And the Curtain of Distraction's whole point was like behind this curtain, when the curtain is revealed, you'll see like, unicorns making out or like almost naked kayakers trying to like kayak through like the students. It's all sorts of craziness. And then at its like peak madness, you had like Michael Phelps come out and like only his gold medals, like just really like absurd, trying to psych out the free throw shooter, the away, whatever the away team was, trying to psych him out. And so I wanted to know, like, is that real? Like I wanted to know, is there an effect there? So I took all the data, I analyzed the data, I put a blog post out there. And like a few days later, the ever popular Justin Wolfers emailed me and Wolfers, who writes for The Upshot and has a column in the New York Times, he was like, this would be a great idea for a blog. Like, send me the data and like, could we like turn this into something for The Upshot? And I was like, absolutely. So helped him out a little. Really, he took it the majority of the way, but using my data and some of my analyses from my blog, it ended up going on to The Upshot. And then like days later, and this is going to be like, this is weird because like this is right next to me right now. So like days later, he calls me and he's like, hey, if you're near a New York Times, if you could purchase one, you're on it. Like you're on the front page of it. So like I went and like I bought a New York Times and like I'm at Utah State, so New York Times are kind of hard to find in rural Utah. So I found this, and then on the bottom fold was the stuff I did for free throw shooting.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so it was literally at this moment in my life, I could literally point to the moment in my life where I thought neuroscience, although like in academia, you get kind of like, I guess the bad way to say it would be like you get kind of like tricked or hazed into thinking that like all you have in your life is academia and you have no translatable skills outside of academia. And it was at that moment where I was like, oh, maybe I do have translatable skills that aren't just specific to analyzing behavior and like correlating that to like brain activity. Maybe the stuff I was doing is actually closer to like sports analytics or data science than I thought. So I spent that entire team from that moment on and into 2016 going to new conferences for sports analytics and data science and meeting new people and talking about like what would I need to fill in the gaps of what I already knew in terms of like time series analysis, processing data, different clustering or data reduction, dimensional reduction techniques, and all the stats that I already knew. I knew that was good, and that was probably more than I needed for data science. But in terms of the computer science side, what did I need? And I spent a good 2 years learning everything I needed to know. And then 2016, I applied to a bunch of sports teams. So this is a really good piece of advice for anyone who is in grad school trying to think of like what should I do? When should I start looking for my postdoctoral fellowship? I highly recommend reaching out to people a year plus in advance, because you typically don't have money just like laying around. Like no one has money laying around anymore. Like it's 2020. So if you want on a lab, typically like make yourself known, say what you want to do. If like minds meet up, then that prospective lab PI or advisor will try to start making money for you. So that's what I did. I took that advice and I ended up having my postdoc fellowship secured like a year before I had to start it. So that gave me a year to look for dream jobs. And so I ended up emailing and putting out resumes to like literally only jobs I felt like I would burn my postdoc bridge for. So one of those ended up being the Cincinnati Reds. They called me back and I ended up being their data scientist. So I was awesome. There for 3.5 years.
Were you their first data scientist?
I was one of their first, yeah. So by title, me and another data scientist came in at the exact same time. There were analysts there who did basically what data scientists do. Whether, you wouldn't, they didn't have that title back when they were doing when they were starting that kind of stuff. But yeah, there's always been some of it, but when I got there, we really started blowing it up. So,
well, I have a couple burning questions. So, as a youth, I've been a Reds fan for a long time. My dad grew up in Ohio, and Ken Griffey Jr. is my favorite player, probably for obvious reasons because of the name. But like when I was playing growing up, I hit left-handed. I just wanted to be like him. Although I didn't play outfield, but it's fine. Regardless, before I get into that element of what it's like to be one of the first members on a data science team, I'd love to hear just a little bit more about your experience learning programming. You said you were doing some stuff in MATLAB. MATLAB is a step in that direction, but I think it's a far cry from Python or R. What was that process like for you?
Yeah, so in academia, and perhaps anyone watching this who is coming from academia, they definitely like in STEM research, there's a lot of MATLAB. And the jump from MATLAB to Python, which is what I primarily code in now, it wasn't too difficult, but there was definitely like learning curves, absolute learning curves. So in MATLAB, you typically have like everything at your fingertips. When you load up MATLAB, it loads in all the packages that comes with it. You just have to, like, similar to Python in ways, just have to set the path correctly. And you have access to all the different things you want to download off the MathWorks site or whatever it is. So in terms of like convenience, those like the pieces of convenience that Python didn't have, like you have to manually load in what requirements or what packages you want to be loading into your environment. You have to manually update or manage that kind of stuff. Whereas in MATLAB, it's like all in the background doing it for you magically. There were some nuances like that where I didn't realize that was something I had to pay attention to. Just like the sheer convenience of MATLAB and things like MATLAB that just maintain things on the back end that you don't really realize. So just like even I didn't really know like what I had to do in order to have my environment just like MATLAB, because going from MATLAB to Python, all I wanted was give me MATLAB, but I'm typing Python. So I got it to a point where it was like, all right, these are the handful of packages I need. These are the handful of things I want to do. I could piece it all together and like kind of pour coding practice ways, like using, MATLAB's all based off like integer location of things, like where like row 10, to get row 10, you just type in the number 10 and you get row 10. To get a column, if you want like a column that's specific to like the year, and like that column's like 183, you couldn't just type in like column year. You would have to type in like column 183, and you would have to know it by like some like rhythm of the data having it like a piece of you or something. You're one
with the data.
That's right. Like it's like just an extension of your body. Like knowing specifically where the data, what you want out of your data, that was actually a big upgrade from MATLAB going into Pandas and Python. So being able to just like cut through my data a lot faster was a huge plus. But some of the minuses were like, in MATLAB, they sort of just give you like one way to do things. And I feel like, we all just like shove everything into like the signal processing package that we don't like think about anything on the back end of it. And it just like magically does like Fourier transform, and it's perfect. But like other packages specifically in Python, like they're more like what you would consider like machine learning or modeling type packages, where there are like parameters to tune and aspects of it where if you adjust certain conditional values, you're going to get a different distribution or a different prediction or what have you. So that's not to say that doesn't exist in MATLAB, but it was just something that like we never questioned. Like none of the research that I ever did questioned out of the box techniques that came out of MATLAB. Yeah.
So was it more like, okay, I know how to do this in MATLAB, I'm going to try and do the same thing in Python? Or was there any like, oh, I have to learn the fundamentals? Or was it just like, look, I'm going to experiment until I get, till I can start doing this, and I'll do projects and learn it that way?
It went backwards. So the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to take a gigantic like CSV exported out of MATLAB, and I wanted to plot the exact same thing that I plotted in MATLAB in Python. So I started with data visualization first because at the very least, like if I
You can
learned
see
how
stuff on
to,
a screen.
yeah, exactly. Like I wouldn't have to like there's only like there's very specifically something called like MATLAB plotting library, matplotlib. So I was like, this should be near 1-to-1. So lo and behold, it was nearly 1-to-1. In fact, the aesthetics that came out of like Seaborn, which is specifically what I was using, were better than the aesthetics that I could get out of MATLAB. So it started there of me just getting comfortable with loading data in and then plotting. And then from there, it was like, all right, I have these results. How do I get these exact same results using packages in MATLAB? So the conceptual pipeline of pre-processing the data, if we believe that all math is the same, regardless of the language that you're using, then we should be able to use the same concepts and just different packages to do them. And I got pretty close. So again, like some default parameters in MATLAB may not be the default parameters in some other package, and then you get just interesting ways to lose data, and then you end up with like slightly different answers. But in the end, in terms of academics, like it was close enough, good enough for rock and roll, as someone once said to me. So
Well, I really like that description you gave. I think one of the most common questions that I get is, oh, what language should we learn? Should I learn Python? Should I learn R? And my thought is, look, learn one of them, learn it really well, because that gives you a framework to learn a new language off of. Even though MATLAB has some idiosyncrasies, I mean, I wouldn't consider it truly a programming language. You could still base your understanding off of Python off of a framework that you've established there. So that, I mean, it's kind of like transfer learning almost, is you have some similarities and you can move them over. And people get so wrapped up in like, oh, if I learn one, I can't learn the other. No, learning one actually makes it easier for you to learn another one of these languages.
yeah,
So,
I agree with all of that too. Something I promote is also the same thing. Like learn one thing really well, and you'll be able to figure out all the other things at some point if you need to.
So I think in sports and academia, R is probably more prevalent than it is in industry. I found that most companies that I work with are generally more focused on Python. And then this is a huge, broad, overarching statement, so it might not be true. But I feel like at least in football and in some of basketball, R is a lot more prevalent. In baseball, what does that split look like between Python and R?
Name of Hadley Wickham.
Well, I might have to edit this part out. I don't want that troop coming after me.
So the I think they're just sort of, their community is built around like really great engagement, really great community, and they're really like like they're really trying to solve very specific problems. And I think something that sometimes gets lost on the developer side is you want to fix all the problems that seem like relevant to fix within the realms of your package. But a lot of people who are developing in R, specifically these sports libraries that a lot of people tend to use, they're typically trying to solve for functionality problems and not necessarily like structural problems inside of their packages. So like, for example, I was helping Ben Baldwin, who maintains the NFL Fast R data repo, and I was just bringing up different data issues like, hey, these IDs are off, or something's weird with these seasons, or something's weird with this like way that they score things. And he spent a lot of time like fixing very specific functional things, because in the end, like it doesn't, like, you know, the one or two missed rows of data, if they're like really erroneous and hard to find the source for, you might just drop them out of
Not worth it, yeah.
Yeah, you know, there's like millions of rows, like 2 rows missing is just, it doesn't move the needle. But in terms of sports, like when people think about 1 row, we, especially in a lot of the data that we get from NFL, it's like 1 play, right? And that 1 play could be a touchdown, or that 1 play could be the game-ending play. So people are really finicky and really like nuanced based when it comes to like solving functional capabilities of data. You want complete games, and if you don't have a complete game, then you might drop the entire game if you don't have every single play like accounted for, because it's hard to create the story if you're missing something really big or really important. So that's also a generalization, but I would say in general, the community itself is very loud in terms of like data cleanliness and accuracy, and I think that sort of like breathes a lot of life into the usability of a lot of different PAR packages and stuff, because of the startup cost is so low, because the people maintaining the packages are doing such a good job at making the data really out of the box useful, and out of the box it's very clean already. So that's a long way of me saying like there definitely is a good amount of R folk in sports analytics. I would say it's not 100% or even majority R. I would say through the different layers of sports analytics, it's not just people who are like solving predictive analytics and doing modeling anymore. You have front-end engineers, back-end engineers, you have people who are specifically working with database ingestion, you have people who are focused specifically on science communication. So data analytics as a whole, R is maybe a piece of it, but like things that are far more like perhaps out there is still Python, I'm guessing. So a lot of front-end development happens in Python still, a lot of back-end development pipes all through Python. It's just a very universally loved language between people who aren't specifically people dealing with data. As a person who also does all of their analytics in Python, I also find myself like having analogous tools that I have in R. And at times, sometimes packages exist solely in Python that I wish existed in R. But, you know, R, again, they're trying to solve, at least in my opinion, like people who learn R for sports and sports analytics, the startup cost is so much lower, and therefore like they're able to do cool things so much faster. And it's not, I guess it's not a diss on R people either. Like a lot of people want me to have this like, you have to take a stance, R or Python, choose. And I'm like, you don't, you really don't.
I think what makes a good data scientist, or one of the elements, is that you choose the right tool for the task at hand. You know, if you're talking about dimensionality reduction, you're talking about some aspects of normalization, I personally much prefer the R packages there. I think they're easier to work with. Like you can spin them up pretty quickly. Some of the factor analysis stuff, for me, that works a lot better because you can see what the inner workings of it better than what goes on in Python. And that's totally fine. You know, not every project has to be all Python, all R. I mean, hell, you can do some stuff in Excel if that's the quickest way to get it out and it makes the most sense. So I agree with you. I don't think that there's a need to take a stand. Although, you know, I obviously personally prefer Python because, you know, I come more from a computer science background, and I prefer something that is more of a programming language, even though, you know, Python definitely has its problems in terms of programming languages, but that just has been a lot more normal for me, a lot easier for me to generalize. Let's say I didn't want to do something data science related. You know, I wanted to productionize something. I mean, R-Shiny's fine, but like there's other elements of that I am more comfortable with, other tools and frameworks out there. So, you know, I kind of jumped away from the sports analytics stuff, but I'd really like to hear how you broke into your first role. Are there any things that you did specifically that you think really helped your chances? Because, from my experience, sports is kind of like a fraternity. It's very difficult to get in, but once you get in, you're pretty endeared.
Yeah. I get this question a good amount too. And someone once told me before a talk, I tell them like, oh yeah, this is like my talk, blah, blah, blah. This is, and they were like, maybe you don't want to tell prospective sports analysts that you were in the front page of the New York Times, because like now they're thinking the only way in is if I become this front page of the New York Times person. And that's not necessarily true, obviously. There's very much many people who are on the New York Times that make their way into sports. The two big things I would say is that really helps chances is like have a little self-awareness in terms of what you're putting out there. So when it comes to a resume or when it comes to like your name being Googleable, think about like not just like risk aversion, like, oh, hide my accounts, blah, 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 but try to like promote yourself positively too. Like I tell a lot of people that like GitHub is the new LinkedIn. Yeah. I very much care very little about like accolades, and if you could show me in your code somewhere, anywhere, like you have good process, you have good methodology, you have like clean requirements, you have good readme docs, you have like a concept of like PR branching and like having like commitment to like good coding practices and good style guide usage. Like that stuff is far more interesting and compelling to like get you into sports than, hey, here's my resume, I am XYZ of a person with
look at all my certificates.
Yeah, exactly. Like I don't need that, because you're going to, like you said, it's a very like selective group of people, and although we are trying to strive to get the best people, we know that like us getting the best people and their price point, like that's very difficult for sports industry in general. The next group of people who are very skilled, who would sort of be in that realm of like sports analytics price point, those folks are also very difficult to get, because they know like, oh, I'm so smart, I don't have to work for a team, I could work for a gigantic tech company and make like 3 times the amount of money or something, which may or may not be true, depending on the team you choose. But it is true that sports analytics itself, we are not up to industry standards in terms of tech innovation. Like, how much you could definitely ask around and see.
I think that comes as a huge surprise to people too. I was having a conversation and they're like, oh, all these basketball teams must have this type of technology, where they're tracking this, that, and whatnot. And I'm like, no. They're like, no, they have to have like this other technology where they're doing this. Like, it seems like pretty quote unquote basic. Any like super tech forward team would do it. It's like, no, they're not doing that. Like, there are very few teams across any of these sports that are truly taking it to an advanced level. I mean, even in baseball, I would imagine that's one of the most that had the earliest jump on this. There's still people that are way ahead and people that are way behind. It's like one of these kind of things, like a double distribution there, which I think is fascinating.
No, it's I would say it's definitely in baseball, there's so much new data sources that are coming into the fold that it's, on one side, we don't have gigantic teams of data scientists who are just like uncovering every important morsel of information from every new data feed that comes in. There are far more vendors and new data that are coming in than
there are people to analyze it. Yeah.
So like, if you get into sports analytics, by the way, great job security because tons of data to work with.
Yeah, but good luck keeping your hair, right?
Yeah, that's right. So definitely long days, but
So
I would say, yeah.
I
Go
cut you
for it.
off. What was your second? Your first point was about the creation and your personal presence.
Yeah. So first point, definitely have like a GitHub. Definitely have some visibility into the work that you're doing. Put yourself out there. The second thing that I would say is like an emphasis on the put yourself out there piece of it. So if you're interested in sports analytics, start going to conferences, start trying to include yourself into some of those communities. You don't have to say a lot or do a lot to start putting your work out there. I personally recommend conferences for any student out there because you sort of have the double whammy of like being able to get conference money from your university, go to the conference with some of it paid, and then also like you're not committing to anything. You don't need to have a job in that, one conference you go to. You go to a handful of different conferences, you start building your own network, you start meeting people and getting introduced to people that you might not have known if you didn't go to a conference. There are obviously some like, haves and have-nots in this case. It's obviously not 100% an equal footing. There are definitely people who can go to conferences, and there are going to be people who aren't. But hopefully, if you can't go to one in person, or if you can't go to one at all, try to find the internet communities out there. So there's definitely a lot out there in terms of Twitter, and personally, I know there's like a blossoming community on Twitch. So
Awesome. Well, I might have to get involved in that one day. We'll see. I don't think I have the bandwidth for that, but I think the platform and the live streaming is fascinating. Major kudos to you. I don't know if I have the stomach for that yet. So, I do want to emphasize a couple of things that you said. You said that someone had mentioned you, oh, maybe you shouldn't tell them that you're on the front page of the New York Times. Honestly, that's what I would lead with, because if you're thinking about it, you are creating stuff, one, to help other people understand, to create value for other people, but also to help you learn. And when you produce stuff like that, you literally never know what could happen with it. Just like your scenario, you could end up on the front page of the New York Times. Or I have another friend who I interviewed, his name's Data Science, well, his name's Jay, but his YouTube channel is Data Science Jay. He did some work, and with a company's data, it was also published by the news. And then he went on to actually work for that company whose data he was using. So the thing is that, out of the sample of maybe 6 people that I've, maybe a little bit more, have interviewed for the show, 2 of them have actually had their work published nationally, right? Or at least locally, whatever that would be. So if you're doing good work and you're sharing it, you could get recognized, and that can turn into so many other scenarios. I mean, if you publish bad work, like, frankly, most people, unless you're a very public platform like myself or you, they don't really notice, right? So try and work on the good things and get it out there. The second thing is networking, 100%. You didn't mention it in your kind of process, but almost every data scientist that I've talked to, they've got their job through an employee referral or through a recruiter. It's very rare, and it's also very impressive that people that go through the traditional process without having some sort of warm connection rather than a completely cold connection have landed their positions. So I think that your obviously your advice is spot on, but I wanted to share that almost everyone that I've talked to is having a very similar experience, but only you're the only one that's been published in the New York Times. So
yeah, no, I would say just off of that too, going back to the idea of like just putting your work out there. Some of the more interesting things that I end up seeing is someone will have like a really old project in their GitHub or something, or someone will have like something like seemingly so disconnected from what they've been doing or what they've been presenting in terms of like their interview process or something. And then we bring it up, and it becomes like a shock of fear that like, oh my gosh, he went like years back into my repo, and like now we're like digging up these like demons of horrible coding. That in itself is also like, in my opinion, really interesting because one, like those old projects that you end up putting out there that you may think are bad, well, maybe they are bad. Maybe they're just like, there's a lot of projects I have in my GitHub repo that are just
Mine too.
like, yeah, just like what's that still doing public? So, like, so for me, knowing that like people can actively see whatever state my code is in, I'm also completely happy to talk about like ways that I would want to improve it if given a little more time on it. And that's usually where the conversation goes, is if you do have like, say, imperfect projects out there, never think about that as like a slight that's going to be against you in like the interview process. A lot of the time it's just another icebreaker, a stepping stone towards like a way to show that you do have like the ability and the competency and the foresight of being what really matters as a good data scientist. So,
well, I think people like to see progress. So if they can see some of your old repos and see how much you've improved to your new ones, that doesn't mean that, that to them isn't like, oh, he's stayed static throughout his whole career. That means he started somewhere and they've inevitably grown. I mean, I see that, for example, on my YouTube channel. Some of my early videos are absolute garbage, but I leave them up because if someone watches my old one and then they watch a new one, they'll be like, wow, this person's content has grown. This person has been able to adapt and change and slowly iterate. And what employer doesn't want someone that has shown that type of growth over time? That means that maybe if I hire you, I can actually get some of, I can teach you new things because you're open to learning them, you're open to improving them. Kind of, I guess, pivoting into the, now you're a data science manager, and I imagine you're responsible for hiring and things like that. You did touch on one thing, obviously the repo thing, but what are some of the other characteristics in people or things that you look for in a new employee?
I'll start just unsure if I want to start like things I really want or things that should be like basic, but I think I'll probably start basic just to not scare people. So, so I'd say the most basic things would be like having a preferred language and competency in it. So being able to like demonstrate like, hey, if we're talking one-liners, introductory kind of things, like I work in Python, I pull my data through in this particular way, and I output my outputs in these particular ways. I'm familiar with these packages or familiar with these concepts. That's sort of like an intro level of like, if you're able to talk about going from beginning to end of a project pipeline very much in like an elevator talk, then I'm going to feel pretty comfortable about like your grasp on the bare basic concepts I need as someone who's working on my team as a data scientist. So like for me, and probably for you too, like, God, you could talk about like all the different ways to take a project from beginning to end, and like I could pick any one and like spit it out in like a few seconds and say like, yep, and that's like one way of the hundreds of ways I've ever done it. So seeing like comfortability and confidence in someone being able to do that, that's bare basic importance. If you don't have like the competency and confidence to run through like a project from beginning to end, then
so would a kind of hands on the ground example of something that would assess that be like, hey, for example, we have some missing data. What are some ways that you can impute it, or how would you handle that in some cases? Is that something that you would be looking at, or in each of those kind of steps in the process?
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that particular question. That was actually a question I got in my
one of my favorite questions. So
one of my most recent interviews. So like, yeah, that's definitely like a very, in my opinion, that's a very simple like universe of things that you could talk about and how you would handle missing data, right? And like the very most easy answer in the machine learning predictive analytics realm would be like, you would want to predict your missing values, given like the full data set that you have that doesn't have missing values, and how you do that, bring the data in, cleaning the data, figuring out like the distribution, figuring out the different predictive ways you would do it. That's all well and good. Like I would like to hear that too, and that would like definitely inspire more confidence in for me in that particular candidate. So I would say like that would be the start. The second layer of it would be like the things that like really like would be the next tier, would be like less about the basic introductory level stuff and more talking about like in terms of data science, like just good data science methods and techniques. So like experience with hyperparameter tuning, experience with the difference of like GPU versus CPU processing, different larger or deep learning packages. So whether it's, you know, you're doing things in XGBoost or Lite GBM, all the way through into like PyTorch or Keras or something. Your familiarity with, you know, different statistical methods or methodologies, like it's good to hear someone talk about like validation and cross-validation stuff, but it's more interesting to hear someone say, you know, I help choose my modeling and my features via SHAP values. And it's like, okay, this person's like on the very cutting edge of machine learning and data science and model validation. Those are all things that like would impress me and would move you into a tier of like, all right, this person's not just confident and competent, but this person has like a thumb on the pulse, if you will, in terms of what is new and what's important out there in the realm of data science as it is. So I would say that would be like that scary next tier, that there may be words in there that like the average or the novice data scientist might not know about, but those are all things to aspire to, I would say.
Awesome. You know, and I think that that's part of the fun of data science too, is to see what's on the horizon, what's on the frontier, what people are working on. And I think just the reference of things that are happening in the community, right? The reference to, oh, I saw that this new benchmark was out, or I saw that this you know, TensorFlow 2.0 has these features and I wanted to experiment with it. Even if they don't have a complete command, I think that that's something that people really struggle with. They're like, oh, there's all these different tools that are asked on the job requirement, and do I have to know them all? And the answer is no. But like, if you know of them, for the most part, unless it's like Python, that should be enough, because that familiarity means that it's on your radar. If you can talk about it intelligently, they probably figured that you could pick it up relatively easy.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree about that. It's you know, the newest hotness right now is people talking about GPT-3 train models. You know, like if I was in an interview and someone starts talking to me about GPT-3 stuff, I'd be like, okay, cool.
We're not there yet, but
like we get it, you know, data science, bro. So yeah, I would see that as like a nod, like, oh, this person is very much tied into the cutting edge or the cutting wave of data science. But you know, depending on, and again, like definitely don't just like name drop things out of the blue. Definitely make it relevant in your
before every interview. Just look up all the new packages, make sure to name each of them once. I'm kidding. Please don't do that.
Yeah. Some of the, I guess like the cherry on top for me, very briefly, I know it's a data science channel, but you can't go a day without talking about some infrastructure. So people with knowledge about cloud computing and Docker and the differences between Spark versus SQL would be good. So things that are like secondary to like your primary job, which is finding insights through data, but things that definitely support your job, like different things you know about databasing or different things you know about managing environments. Those things are huge pluses in my mind, because I know personally, as a data scientist, having experienced being the noob in those realms and like needing someone to hold my hand through that kind of stuff, like if I knew anything, if I knew a little, it would have helped me so much more. And so having people, like you said, if you have just even the concept of it, it helps so much more. So
Awesome. So one thing we didn't really touch on with that is the assessment of business understanding and business value. What are some ways that you evaluate that? How much weight do you put into that? And kind of that, like how important, and how do you illustrate that?
Yeah, I think there's like, I'm going to say from my experiences there, I've seen two ways to answer this question. There are people who put a lot of weight into it, and then like almost like binary, there are people who put like basically no weight into it. So like the blend of like, oh, this person has a little of this and a lot of that doesn't exist. It's like you go full bore into this person who's like domain expertise like oozing out of their eyes or something, and then very little in terms of like coding practices or like familiarity with like statistics or whatnot. And then on the other side, there's this person who's like, will like eat machine learning for breakfast, and then like all the podcasts they listen to are like about like tech, and then
they're listening to zeros and ones in the in their earphones.
That's right. And they have just like not just no idea about the domain they're in, but like no, like there's no skin in the game for them if like something is like a plus or a minus about their company or something. So like, our company is performing really well today or something, and they're like, I don't care. Data. So I'd say like there are like absolutely two hyperbole here, and hyperboles is like, do you pluralize hyperbole? Is there an S at the end of hyperbole?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Check us in the comments, y'all. Is hyperbole?
Can you pluralize hyperbole?
The two extremes of like someone who doesn't have any business knowledge versus someone who has a lot of it, there's some middle ground there. Personally, if I had to choose one of the extremes, I would always choose the person with the data experience over the business experience, because the person with the data experience, that learning how to do good data science and good data science methods is, in my opinion, a lot steeper of a learning curve than learning about the domain. Ideally, both of them are very difficult to gain complete expertise over. So to have mastery over either is very difficult. But at least with business, there are some starting points that are very human, whereas learning like, here's how you manage a virtual environment. This is how you pull in the data. This is how you install these things. This is how you run it so like it doesn't break. Those things are not humanistic. Those things are like, I have no relation to this because I am a person, and I like money, sleep, and eating. If it's not in those terms, then I don't know. At least with a business, it's like, hey, this is what we did to make money. Like, oh, okay, all right, money. All right, we got that. But in Python, it's like, hey, this is what we do to like load in data. It's like,
yeah, good. So I think one thing people don't realize when it comes to that conversation is that each data science role is different. And some of the data science roles are just purely focused, or even machine learning engineering roles are purely focused on implementation. You're not going to be dealing with any stakeholders. It's more engineering than it is visualization and communication. And frankly, those people don't really need the business value understanding as much. They don't need the communication skills because they're going to be working on something fairly linear. I personally, my view of the future of data science is there's going to be a divide, and there's going to be people that are moving purely towards implementation, and then the other group is moving towards the communication of these findings. And so if you're in that communication of findings group, you're going to have to understand the business value, you're going to have to speak in the business terms, but you're going to still have to understand at least the mechanisms in place for what's going on in the implementation side, and then the opposite for that group. So depending on what kind of role anyone who's watching this wants, I think it really pays to understand how you fit into those things. And I mean, at the very least, you still do have to come off as a human and not a robot when you're interviewing, because you're interviewing with other humans, hopefully most of the time.
Yeah, we would hope. We would hope so. That actually, just to harp on that point one more moment, at least in baseball, that divide is very much apparent already. Like the Tampa Bay Rays, they have a coach whose very much only job is to interpret analytics. So he is a coach who sits on the bench. He, dresses up for game day. He's got a number on his back. It's just his job isn't to work with the players. He works with the data and interprets it to the players. So that role is becoming more and more prevalent in many different organizations. You can point to a lot of different organizations who have these types of bench coaches or fourth coaches who are very specifically analytics type coaches, or process is what they're calling it, process type coaches, who are like data scientists light, where they can do all the data science stuff, but they're put in a coaching role to explain and be the science communicator. So even, when we look at tech and we look at, like you said, there should be specializations of like communicators versus implementers. We're already seeing that in sports, just because the need for communication is also extremely high at sports, because the starting point of technology competency is a lot lower than, say, at your traditional tech company, right? Not everyone in sports knows anything about computer science. So
yeah, well, I think for my career, what has really helped me is that, I played golf in college. I played professionally for a little bit. Like, if you can communicate that you have some expanded knowledge of how sports work, either as a fan as from playing it, it probably shouldn't be that way, that'll help get you hired, but it really can. If people feel like, hey, we're talking because we both understand the game, we're obsessed with the game, not even the numbers aspect, I think that there's a ton of, maybe not value, but there's that commonality that you share that is different than quite a lot of other industries. If I'm crazy about CPUs or something, and I'm applying to AMD, like, that'll probably help, but not in the same sense that if I have that understanding of baseball, would help me in that other realm. Is that something that you see as well, or?
Yeah, I'd say definitely something like that. I was just on a call talking about there's two different, this is a little tangential, but there are two different like pipelines of information that data scientists might generate, and it's like there is like action driving reports where like you put out information and it's supposed to drive an action, and it's very direct about like the recommendation or about the information that's supposed to help like persuade or tip a decision towards like a more optimal route. So there's like action driving reports, and there's like knowledge driving reports where the knowledge gained from the report isn't necessarily 100% actionable, but it does like drive the knowledge of the business up a lot higher. And typically those reports are like the things that get you buy-in with other groups in the company or other groups or other people in the company. So that might be a report that's really specific to like, hey, we saw this problem in this one store. Can you compare that store to a store that's like it? And then you do it and it's like, hey, this is the reason why we believe that the store is doing this or that. And it's like not very actionable in terms of the broader sense of the business, but it does get a lot of buy-in from that particular stakeholder who now like sees like, oh, data science can help solve these other problems too. So sometimes I think about that way where like rather than like direct or indirect influence of data science, it's they're all direct or they're all influential. It's just sometimes you're putting
Some
out
more
work
measurable than others.
Correct. Yes.
Very cool. So, well, I would add that there is a third type of product that you can have, which is just a system that you put in place where, you're targeting customers based on what, feed something into a model and it tells you what commercial to send to a specific customer. I mean, that's the third type of product that's generally in that space. Just for anyone's watching who's thinking about, oh, well, like what do I produce as a data scientist? It's those, I don't think they're really anything other than those three types of things, aside from maybe some pipelines and systems that I don't know if you'd consider the truest form of data science. But, kind of talking about things that you produce, you've had a lot of focus on visualization recently, and I'd love for you to talk more about the importance of visualization and a little bit more about what you're doing in that space.
Yeah. So, as you know, data visualization is generally some of the most powerful stuff you could produce as a data scientist. Sometimes, literally, one visualization can be like the deal maker, the deal breaker of a report. And the absence of one is usually very telling that, like, it's a weird thing to think about, but it's like, if you don't have a visualization, that it's like an incomplete report, which like is absolutely not true. You could definitely have reports that don't have visualizations that are completely complete. But it is something to be said that data visualization is very much valued by people who do not have expertise in either data or analytics or insights or whatever you want to call it. So having very clear, good, aesthetically pleasing, and simple data visualization is really important to be not just aware of, but like self-aware, because we can all point to like really good, aesthetically pleasing data visualization, like, oh, this has a clear trend, or this has clear correlations, or this represents this information very, very nicely or succinctly. But we, a lot of the time as data scientists, don't have that same self-awareness of like, hey, my graph is easy to interpret, or my graph is like, it doesn't have distracting colors, or I think it's good in one gigantic clump of colors versus separate into different pivots or something, or facets rather. So something for me that's really important is when you're reflecting on your data visualization, you can reflect either in the moment, like, let's give it a day and see if I like have the same interpretation the next morning about this. But you could also reflect like really long term, and something we're doing on my Twitch stream is we are bringing guests on, and we are looking at really, really old data visualization that they put out maybe years ago. And I've done it a couple times now where like I've brought up stuff from like 7 to 9 years ago, and it's like absolutely horrendous looking stuff, like Excel sheets that are like color coded, that like have just horrible colors.
I'm trying to find one while we're on here.
Yeah, just horrible colors. And like ultimately the thing that I really cared about is like a column that I'm not even coloring. So there's aspects of data visualization where like, and I'll steal this from one of the professors I had in grad school, Scott Bates. He once said like, when we're presenting information, particularly like on slides or something. Like, are you presenting this information to share with your audience, or are you presenting this information to share with yourself? And I thought that was pretty important to hear, because it's similar in data visualization. Are you presenting data visualization to give to your audience to have a better insight or a better look into the data? Or are you really more so providing it for yourself as like a visual representation?
Here's proof of what we did.
Yeah, right. Like, do you like how much is the data visualization really for someone else versus for you? And I think that's sort of like the start of it. And a lot of people, their first data visualization is like, this is data visualization for me. Like, I am plotting my data and like creating a visualization that is like my interpretation of what the data means. But that's not necessarily like, quote unquote, the reason we want to use data visualization. We want to provide stronger insights and better communication tools using visualization or visual representation of data. And we have to think a little harder than like how I want to look at this data. We should be thinking like, how is this going to be interpreted? Or how is this going to be interpreted by someone who has no idea about the data? So, so in our process of like looking at really old data visualization to what we look at now, like my stuff from 10 years ago versus my stuff today, there's a vast difference, and there's a vast like clarity discrepancy of like, oh, this information's a lot clearer. This really presents the information in a way that like makes sense to people. This looks like, I don't know.
How about this one? I just found this in some of my grad school stuff. Oh my God. You ready for this?
Let's see.
It's not even on the page correctly. What the hell was I doing? I don't know.
Oh man.
This is for, I think we did a report for like Kate Spade or something, and oh my goodness, it's bad, man.
Look at that. I like the screenshots of tables with like colors on them.
You gotta like that, right? I mean, this is oh, look at that. Oh yeah.
Those triangles. Oh yes.
Oh man.
Yeah.
I'm embarrassed. I need to get rid of that.
But that's like a great example of like, everyone will make plots just like that, right? Everyone will start out
at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone's going to mess around with the, Excel chart wizard at some point and see a way to make your data, tell a story in a way that like not only like resonates with you, but like visually represents it in like a cool or a different way. And a lot of the cool ways that you initially think of are not great communication avenues that you should be taking. So yeah, on our channel, we're looking at, how you've evolved from a person who does data visualization in the past to the person who does data visualization now, and what it took for you to get from one point to the other.
Well, hopefully I've improved, because
well, when we have you on, we'll talk way more about your embarrassing plots.
For sure. I would be happy to. So I think the last question I really want to, the last pure question, and then I'm happy to have you talk about anything that you find relevant or any parting words, is about how you got started streaming, how you got started on Twitch. I think that's a very interesting space. I would imagine, I think that live streaming is very different from kind of the recorded content that I do. And I'm fascinated in the space. Something, honestly, I've even been pretty intimidated about. So I would love to hear your story, your onus, and what that's like, really.
Yeah, so I've been streaming on Twitch since grad school. So I believe I am in my 5th year of streaming. Yeah, so
it's like as long as I've been doing data science.
That's yeah, I've been streaming for a long time, and as you can imagine, the science and technology category in Twitch, and specifically the data scientists who stream on Twitch, they're not necessarily the most popular streamers or streams that you could be in, but they're definitely very informational. I try to think of my stream now as more like content and entertainment driven than I think about it as educational. There's definitely a lot of people who sit in just to watch me like cut away through data using like pandas techniques they've never seen before. But I think of it more as a conversation. So it's me just coding in the background and talking about the science or the data set we're doing or different things in terms of like how to get into sports analytics or how to get into analytics in general or what it takes to become a data scientist. So very similar to the stuff you're doing on in your videos here, just live and maybe sometimes repetitive if you're a return viewer. Sometimes a lot of people hear very similar things from me. One of the things that people always will hear from me is like, always explicitly set your index values because you get burned by that in pandas. People think
Reset
that
index.
Yeah, like so if you don't do a reset index all the time, you need to have a running index that you could shove into your index values. People really don't understand that, and they don't get like why that's important. But then like I'll show them like, oh yeah, if you don't do that, like here's where your predictions go, and they're like, oh, that doesn't line up with where I want them to go anyway. And it's like,
I'm guilty, so I should.
well, I had to learn the hard way, which is why I'm so adamant at people doing it. So it's, in my opinion, they're live streaming and live coding. It's very at first it was somewhat humbling, I think, as a person who's just like very comfortable with being embarrassed or very comfortable with being myself, especially like in front of others. Live coding was something that like I never thought of it as something like, oh, people are gonna like think of this and think of me as like some like person who sucks at coding or someone's horrible at coding. It was very much the opposite. And then even more so than that, when there are like quote unquote experts in the chat who know way more than I do, they typically become like my own personal Stack Overflow. So I'll be doing something wrong and then they're like, hey, do it this way. I'm like, oh, this was a way better way to do it. And they're like, yeah, this is why, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, thank you. That was very helpful.
You know, they say the quickest way to learn is just immediate feedback, right? And there are two things I like, again, about either making videos or doing something live, is that one, you get the feedback, but two, there's some accountability there, right? Let's say you set a stream or you say you're going to make a video, there's people at least depending on you to be there for a certain amount of time or depending on you to make a video for that amount of time. And that, for me, that structure has been really useful and actually encouraging me to follow through and to continue to do things. When I have just a little bit of added pressure to make sure that, hey, like you said you were going to make this video, you said we're going to do 2 videos a week. And personally, I don't like disappointing people. I'm sure I've disappointed quite a few people, including my parents. But, you know, that's something that little added tweak, I think, has been really good for me, at least to continue and to continue to learn, really.
Yeah, I got this advice from like very, very old, great friend of mine, Brian, and he once told me, the more you immerse yourself in something you really want to do, the more ways you attack it from the more directions you can. Like the faster you get to mastery. That's somewhat of a, I guess it's almost like a no-brainer. Like, yes, you do something more often. If you do it from multiple different ways, hopefully you do it so often that you will become more experienced. It's not like whoa, that's a crazy, what a brain hack. But I think it is true. Like for me, in terms of coding, I couldn't just learn coding if I was just taking courses and just pushing up stuff into like a repo no one like is collaborating with me on, right? Like as I said before, you know, my way into data science or computer programming in general is pretty a-traditional, and therefore like I'm not going to necessarily be very comfortable with like the traditional ways to learn things. So having multiple ways to learn things and also stay fresh in things, like doing things like that produce data science driven content, I think that has definitely been helpful. And from like my experiences blogging, you know, you don't have to be someone who does it live. You could definitely just do it and make posts at random public places, and you'll find feedback if you want it. So,
well, one thing I've really enjoyed about this, or about doing any content creation, is that I think if you're clear up front that you don't know everything. I mean, I don't know everything about data science or data science careers even, or even close, but I'm willing to listen, I'm willing to learn. And for things that I don't know, I'm more than happy to hopefully bring people in to talk more intelligently than I can. And people enjoy the journey. People enjoy watching you grow and watching you understand topics and watching you to expand your knowledge. It can be inspiring for other people. And I think that that's one of the beauties of the vlogging or whatever it is that people can join you for that experience and they can see your growth and they can grow with you. And so I think that that's so cool that you're also a part of that in the Twitch community, even probably a more raw form than I'm doing it. So last kind of thing is, you have anything extra to add, any closing advice, anything you'd like to share with the community? I'll make sure your Twitter handle is in the video somewhere, and any other, and Twitch handle as well.
Yeah. I guess like in terms of parting advice, something that particularly for people who are starting in data science, something that is really important to remember, if you're a student or if it's your first job at some place and you're an entry level or an intern type, I know the want is to like impress. Like, your idea of impression is do something no one's ever done before. There is so much you can do where the insight doesn't have to be like the most brand spanking new thing. The more impressive thing is if you were able to finish it, and if you were able to make it clean and be able to put out something that is useful or reusable. Those things are huge, but in the end, if you could take a project from beginning to end and go through a review process, it doesn't need to be this 100% brand new, completely amazing, super idea that no one's ever thought of ever in the existence of the human race. So I would say focus on your skills and don't spend so much time thinking about whether or not your project is cutting edge. If you are put in good positions and if you do well because your skills are good, then they're going to give you projects where the creativity is going to just be more abstract than you could ever possibly imagine. You'll be put in those positions in time. So focus on, in fact, cherish the fact that you can answer very simple questions and do them really well, and that's what you're being evaluated on. So don't try to shoot the moon if you don't have to. Just do good work, and senior or other data scientists will see that, and that goes a lot further. So
I think I've brought up the concept of Occam's razor in almost every interview that I do. And for those who are not familiar, it's basically the simplest approach that produces almost equal value is usually the best one. Maybe I'll start making some merch and dishing it out to you guys or something. But no, that is usually the best approach. And especially when you're starting out, the simpler you can make things that still have a compelling story and that still produce good results, the better off you're going to be, because your boss, they're keeping track of how many projects you finish. They also care about the results, but it's so important not to have these things continue to drag on, because that can so easily happen with data science projects. I mean, you talk about the project management philosophy, a lot of these things. data science is so different than software engineering, where there's a lot more concrete things. Like a lot of the time, it's better to just get it done with an acceptable answer, say it's done, and then maybe iterate on it later. So really awesome stuff. I'm sure everyone who watches this is going to get a ton of value from this. Thank you so much for coming in, Nick. Had a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. And until next time, hopefully I'll be able to go on your stream and we can absolutely dismantle a couple of my old visuals. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have any better ones more recently, but
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Ken. Thanks for having me.